How do the six intrinsics of comparison correspond to the six metrics and the six question types?
So, for example, with the six intrinsics of comparison, right? You notice there are three pairs of two. So,
Right, a
subjective
content and a
object,
context.
yeah. So, subjective object is a pair. So, take that as a modal group, a modal thing. Sameness and difference, that's another set. Those always go together. And content and context is a set. Those also go together.
Yeah.
So those three sets, each of those would be assigned a modality. So now the question becomes, which modality would be which? Well, right, but the emphasis in this case is, like, if I were to draw them on a page, I might put, sameness and difference and then put a circle around it. And then content, context, and put a circle around that. And then subjective and objective and put a circle around that. And then say, these three circles are a triple.
Right. Yes.
Okay. So in other words, I can descend into one of the circles and I can say, like, for subjective and objective, that the third concept would be something like relationship or something like interaction. So I can name that one. I don't happen to have a word in the English language for whatever that concept is that's between the content and context. That's maybe also a version of relationship. So if I said interaction or subjective and objective, then I might say relationship between content and context.
Yeah.
Right. And then I could basically say, well, that's a little bit like the domain of identity, which would be content, and context would be domain, and then relationship is that third term. But I'm now using the word relationship in respect to two triples rather than having it neatly assigned to just one. And when I get to sameness and difference, well, I don't know any word in the English language that comes anywhere close to basically stating what that relationship looks like. Like what is the concept that would be the third of the triple of sameness and difference? Now, that could be posed as a question. I've never thought of anything that would be a word that makes sense for me to fit in there. But they clearly go together. Like, there's no, at this juncture, what I'm looking at is the three circles. One circle contains sameness and difference, one circle is content and context, and one circle is subjective object. So now those three circles, this is the triple for the notion of comparison. So the notion of comparison, remember, is normally held as six intrinsics, but in each of the modal intrinsics is essentially like a vector, in the sense of, like a number line. I have a single point in the middle, and then I have the positive numbers and then the negative numbers. So there's kind of like this axis idea for each of these, like, for instance, the sort of an orthonormal basis. And so on the positive z, I might end up with more objective, and negative z would be more subjective, right? And then if I go positive x, it would be more difference, and negative x would be more sameness. And if I go positive y, it would be more content, and negative y would be more context. So if you want to, you can think of this orthonormal basis as essentially being like a coordinate system in the usual way. And instead of labeling the axis x, y, or z, I'm labeling the extents. So I'm saying, instead of x-axis, what is positive infinity x and what is negative infinity x, right? So in a sense, that the concepts themselves are held as indicators, they're pointers, and so in effect they're defining directions. And so in effect, I can either just name the positive extents and then just assume that there's some sort of negative extent possible, or I can have it be explicitly zero positive. Now, in the sense of the notion of comparison, the net result is that I have 3 groups of 2, and those 3 groups represent the modal bundles.
Yeah.
So in this sense, if I was to do an allocation, I would suggest that it might, like one way we might do the modal allocation is to say that the subjective objective relationship is immanent. The sameness and difference relationship I would hold as omniscient, and the content relationship I'd hold as transcendent. And so, again, the reasons that I would hold those specific ways, well, in this case, it's not actually so easy to describe why I would hold those in that particular assumption. But that would be, at this moment, I'm just wanting to provide a correspondence for those, just so that there's at least something on the page.
Okay.
Right? There can be rationales that would assign it a different way. I don't happen to know one. So, for example, whatever way that we come up with a rationality for that assignment, and there's some that are better than others, but in effect, at this moment, I would say that just off the top of my head, it feels to me more like the sameness and difference thing is more objective. It's easier to point to, and that the notion of content and context is more of a notion that is universal in the same sense that I mean, all of these are universals in a real sense, but it's easier to see it as essentially a kind of holding rather than the thing held. So once we have done that, then we can now look at the other side. So for instance, if we look at the intrinsics of measurement, we also see that there is this pattern of 3 groups of 2. So patterns in space, that's one group. Force in time, that's another group. And probability and possibility, that's another group. So now I've got 3 circles here as sort of what is the notion of measurement, or not so much the notion of measurement, but actually the notion of what is measurable. Like what is the essential things that are measurable, or the root notion of measurability, maybe. And in this case, the assignments are much clearer, right? The force in time is clearly immanent. The patterns in space is clearly omniscient, and the probability probability and possibility is clearly transcendent. Right? This one's much stricter. It's a lot easier to see here, right? So now we have at this point a modal correspondence for each of these domains, and now we can start to essentially do the connections, right? Now, in this particular case, the connections are just going to be straight back and forth because at this moment we don't know if there's a strict requirement of a precursor or a successor relationship between the 2 domains. At this point, we're still in the exploratory phase, right? So I would say, okay, well, in the notion of forces and time as being immanent, that's now going to correspond to the subjective objective of the notion of comparison, right? Yeah. So in a sense, what we're doing here is we're using the relationship between concepts in terms of their structure to try to identify what level of sensibility emerges, right? And so, in effect, when I'm talking about reifying power, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, how much does this clarify the relationship? Do the relationships themselves help us to understand the meanings of the term? In this case, of comparison and the notion of measurement itself, right? Because we have said that taken as a sort of collectivity, like like when I'm looking at it from just sort of a background physics point of view, we've said, well, I don't know of a notion of measurement that isn't a comparison, or a notion of comparison that couldn't be represented by a numeric number. Although in that case, it's a little less obvious, right? But in a sense, there's a sense in which any measurement is like a number, and that number in effect is on a scale, and the scale itself is going to be different than, like there's a 0, an extent on the scale, and a unit of measure, and that allows me to effectively know what the number means. And then in the sense that I compare this number to other numbers, then the notion of comparison becomes doubly invoked. Once to have it be a number itself, and then another time to compare one number to another. So in this sense, there is a there's sort of this aggregate notion of comparison, this aggregate notion of measurement. We're saying, okay, there's clearly a connection between these two. But then when we're doing the decomposition in terms of the intrinsics, we're basically saying, okay, rather than treating the notion of comparison or interaction or measurement as an element, the concept itself, and I'm comparing together as an identity, I'm now treating them as domains. So then we're saying, okay, well, what is the relationship between the domains? In this particular case, we haven't spelled that out yet. We're now in the process of sort of articulating that. So in the sense that effectively we've already made an assignment that the concepts at the overarching level are the same, then we'd expect that there'd be some articulation of how the alignment happens at the intrinsics level. So at this point, that's why I was saying when looking at the domains, I don't really see that there's a clear successor or antecedent relationship between the domains, because I wouldn't expect there to be one in this case, right? Because the identity notion was already established at the level of the aggregate. But at this point, we're now just looking at the intrinsics and how they compare to see kind of what we discover from that. We'll figure out the rest of it afterwards. So in this sense, if we hold that subjective and objective is the immanent out of the comparison notion, and that the notion of forces and time are the immanent in the metric notion, then we can say, okay, well, can we then find the next set? So the next set would be to say, okay, well, sameness and difference in some sort of way relates to patterns in space. And the notion of content and context somehow relates to the notion of probability and possibility. And now all of a sudden, you do notice it actually does make a lot of sense, right? So for instance, how do I identify something as same or different? Well, somewhere along the way, it actually has to be a pattern, right? What is the notion of same pattern or different pattern? Like if I don't have at least some notion of structure in some sort of space, then the notion of sameness and difference is actually quite hard to articulate.
Mm.
And similarly, when I look at the notion of probability and possibility, and I'm basically saying content and context. Well, whether or not something is possible is content of the context of how probable it is as a content.
Mm.
And in effect, and that's one level of it. But in another sense, we're looking at it as like the notion of potentiality is like a notion of energy. And so in effect, like a stone on a hill has potential energy, and stone rolled to the bottom of a hill is essentially an absence of potential energy. And when it's rolling down the hill, we have another notion of energy in the sense of the kinetic, but all of these represent states, right? The notion of stone on a hill as compared to stone off the hill is essentially a comparison of two different states, content and context, as essentially fundamental. Like the difference of states represents essentially the metric of energy. So in that sense, the idea of corresponding those makes a lot of sense. And then when we're thinking about it in the immanent, we have forces and time. There's an inherent asymmetry in both force and time. And so in the sense of the relationship between the subjective and objective, well, insofar as that relationship are things like perception and expression, they're mediated by forces and time. I can't have perception as a process without implying some notion of actual force, because there is a flow of some sort or another. Flow is essentially a way of thinking about force, or force is a way of thinking about flow. I was just talking about turbines and things like that, and it had to do with the flow of water and how much pressure the pushing of the water would have on the turbine blades. So in a sense, there seems to be some at least from a sort of narrative point of view, a kind of reasonably good sounding story about why these correspondences are actually playing out in this specific way, at least as far as the triples are concerned. And this is essentially what we're attempting to establish. Now, when we get to, say, something like the 6 question types, we're going to end up doing the same sort of move. But in this particular case, it's not as obvious to decide in what way we break up the questions into 3 groups of 2. It feels like with the questions that we really have 2 groups of 3.
Mm.
Right? When I think about who, when, and where, those are embodied. And when I think about what, why, and how, those are abstract. Now, we can actually notice that the same sort of division process can happen with the intrinsics of comparison. Like I can say, of that, if I were to sort of put, difference, content, and objective, those would form a group of 3.
Mm.
And sameness, context, and subjective, those would form a group of 3. Now, that feels a little awkward, right? It's a little harder to see that, but it is seeable. It's easier when we look at the 6 metrics, because those are very obviously the top 3 of pattern or mass, force, and probability. That's one group. Those are sort of like the content, right? And then the notion of space, time, and possibility, those are kind of a context, right? So patterns are always in space, forces are always in time, and probabilities are always per possibility, right? For each possible, I have a probability. So if the probability was 0, it wouldn't be possible. And if it wasn't possible, it wouldn't be probable. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So in this sense, the notion of partitioning the metrics into 3 groups of 2 or 2 groups of 3 feel equally facile. Whereas for the questions, it feels more facile to have 2 groups of 3, and not so easy to have 3 groups of 2. We'll come back to this in a sec. And then for the intrinsics of comparison, it feels more like the case that it should be 3 groups of 2, and it's not easy to see it as 2 groups of 3.
And I'm just noticing that when we're doing the 2 groups of 3, that in measurement and comparison, we're drawing one concept from each of the modalities, but when we're doing it of the questions, we're drawing 2 from the transcendent and 1 from the immanent, and then 1 from the immanent and 2 from the transcendent. Is that?
Well, let's go back to the questions for a moment, right? So
Yeah.
let's say we wanted to align these as 3 groups of 2. Now, at first, it seems like just very clearly, I would say that what and who are part of the same group. And then we would say, okay, well, how do we divide up the other 2? In one sense, I would say how and why makes sense as a group, and when and where makes sense as a group. But when we do it that way, you notice that we're lined up differently than we would be than the way we really want to be. Because, like, you remember, if you looked at the 3 groups of 2 with the metrics, it was very clearly the case. I had 3 columns, and I can, like a grid, right? I could basically have this sort of 3 across the top, 3 across the bottom. I could look at these as 3 columns, or I could look at it as 2 rows. But you'll notice that when I do that with the questions, if I bind why and how, that's across, and then the notion of what and who, that's from one group of 3 to the other, and then from when to where, those are both in the same group of 3. So in other words, if I was to really do it, I'd have to say something like where binds to why, and when binds to how, in order to get the same sort of structure relationship as was actually the case with the 6 metrics. Otherwise, I'm not actually constructing 3 groups of 2 with the same sort of geometry as this 2 by 3 grid.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I have to notice that, like, that's a place where confusion can for sure happen, because in the way that we actually use the questions, the binding of 2 groups of 3 is actually quite strong. So in this sense, to see, why and where as a kind of construct is essentially to say, well, where is not interpreted so much as a position in space as it's interpreted as a kind of logical condition. And this is part of what EGS is as a writing technique. Where X, that Y. Or where asking question Y, that I assert X. Yeah, it's definitely like an if then. So it's a conditional structure, except that in EGS, I can have any number of conditions where X, where Y, where Z, where A, and where B, that 1, 2, 3, and 4, or that 1, that 2, that 3, so on, right? And so, in effect, there's the notion of conditionality can be compound, but in the sense of looking at it from the 6 types of questions, the notion of where can be interpreted in a transspatial way. But the notion of how is very much bound to the notion of time, right? You can't do a how unless there's a process. So in a sense, it's like, in that sense, I'm recognizing how might not be abstract. It might be embodied. And in that sense, the when becomes like, if I'm talking about a how in a first person sense, then now I'm looking at saying something along the lines of, first do this, then do this, then do this other thing. There's a sequence of steps. And in that sense, the notion of when is the context in which the notion of how, as the discrete steps that I'm taking, take shape.
Mm.
Okay. So at this point, we now have a credible reason for holding the 6 question types as now bindable in 3 groups of 2. So then it becomes now an option. We can now say, okay, we have 3 groups of 2. There's 3 circles, each of which has 2 question types in it. Which ones are which as far as modal correspondences are concerned? Now, at this moment, we could say, well, let's see, who and what, that feels pretty imminent. Like, I'm just going to say that from my perspective, if I was to do this assignment, I would assign that to be the imminent modality. And if I'm looking at, the notion of, where and why, I'm very much looking at a theoretical construct. I mean, that's why EGS has that form. It's a logic form. And in the sense that logic and omniscient and theory all correspond, I would say, well, those 2 questions, that group of 2 questions, that seems omniscient. And the notion of technique, of practice, of on one hand, we could say it was imminent, but in another sense, we're not talking about practice as I'm doing it in this moment, but practice as I could potentially do it. Right? Like the how is a recipe. So in a sense that the recipe is outside of the domain of actually doing it. When I say how, I'm talking about a recipe. So in that sense that the recipe is in an adjacent domain relative to the domain of the actual practice, then in that sense it actually makes sense to regard it as transcendent. And interestingly enough, you'll notice that in the dynamic of like when we're looking at the 6 questions, we've now created, first of all, a sort of modal correspondence. Now we can start to correspond that to the other three sets of two that we've already established under comparison and the metrics. So in this sense, we can start to do these alignments. But then we're in the previous case, we were saying, well, measurement and comparison, well, we already know these to be the same concept under the root tautology. But when we get to the notion of question, the 6 question types, well, we don't know that that's in a direct relationship to either comparison or measurement. The question isn't technically a measurement. It's like a setup for a measurement, maybe. But then the answer would be the measurement, right? So in effect, in terms of epistemic method, it's not the whole epistemic method. It's just the experiment being performed. I still don't know what the results are. So in that sense, it could very easily be the case that there is an Axiom II rotation that is potentially happening here. It could be that the question as a domain is a precursor to both measurement and comparison as a domain. In this case, it's bound to the transcendent modality. But when is clearly a connection to time. And so if I go to the metrics, I see that in that case, it's in the immanent modality. So that's what I'm talking about in Axiom II rotation, is that in the context of the questions, given the way that we've done a modal assignment here, when is transcendent. How and when are transcendent. But when I go to the metrics, I see that forces and time are immanent. But in a certain sense, the connection between how and force and when and time, those feel like actually the bindings as far as the terms themselves are concerned. So now I'm going to basically have to account for why it is the case that these terms have different modal correspondences in the domain of the questions versus the domain of the measurements. That's an Axiom II rotation happening. And I think in all of the time that we've talked, this is the first time I've just basically evolved one for you. So let's continue, right? So in other words, we're now going to look at the other two sets. So we mentioned that, as I said before, that where and why, those are omniscient. So in the sense of structure, like in the sense of measurement, those would correspond to patterns in space. And sameness and difference. And that actually makes sense, because if I look at it from the point of view of like what I'm trying to do with logic, the sameness part would be the truth carrying part. And the difference part would be essentially the assertions being made. So in other words, can I do a derivation? Like if I'm asking why, it's sort of like I'm starting with some sort of principles and I'm trying to show that something else is true. If I'm doing it analytically, then in effect the sameness part is the truth condition, and the fact of the proof being correct or analytically exact, and the difference condition is, this was the premises I started with, and this over here is the conclusion I ended up with. Or if I have an equality, A equals B, the sameness is the sense of the equality, and the difference is the sense whatever A is. Like Ramanujan did. Like the thing that made Ramanujan's equations super cool was that on one side of the equation you had this fixed form where the symbols that were there represented the entirety of what was happening, and then on the other side of the equation you'd have these infinite repeating series, these continued fractions, or these things that essentially were an expression of this notion of continuity. So you had a symmetry. This fixed thing equals this unending thing, and somehow they're the same. Like his genius was to basically be able to notice this sameness. Like these two forms that look like they have nothing in common. Like there's like how the heck could you have this collection of numbers and operators on this side represent this infinite series of numbers and operators on this other side? Like how did he get from like wherever it was that he started to that expression, right? That would be the thing that Harding was like, he was basically saying like the level of sophistication of process that a person would have to do this is essentially better and more advanced than anything we've ever done. In fact, it's been 100 years for some people to figure out how some of these equations were actually derived or derivable by any means at all, right? So again, sameness and difference. Why and where. So that fits, again, again, we're looking at the ways in which the analytic process and the soundness process, like validity and soundness. Soundness has to do with comparisons in the sense of the symbolism or the what does it refer to, right? So in effect, it's not incorrect. It's necessary to the metaphysics to treat these as correspondences, because that is the soundness relationships. Is it sound for this to connect to that? The modalities effectively are like the generalization of all soundness. So going back to our thing, so then we have what and who. Well, it seems pretty clear to me that the what is the objective and the who is the subjective. Like, that's just point blank direct. So now we've rounded out. So at this point, we have just corresponded the 6 intrinsics of comparison, the 6 metrics, and the 6 question types. We've noticed an Axiom II rotation in one and an absence of one in the other. There's another set of 6 intrinsics. Actually, there's 2 other times in the white book that this notion of 3 groups of 2 or 2 groups of 3s occurs that is explicitly stated, one of which has to do with the 6 paths, and the other of which has to do with a different way of looking at the 6 intrinsics of interaction. I'm not going to try to round out those 2, but the same sort of techniques as we just used would be used there. It's just that in those cases, there are some other abstractions that make it a little more challenging, probably beyond the level of skill that we currently share. So, but look at how far we've come already. We've now taken, fully 18 concepts and 3 generalizations, and reified them under the 3 axioms and the 3 modalities twice over. So as far as metaphors are concerned, or as far as structural relationships are concerned, at this particular point, the power and the robustness of the metaphysics is far more in a way established than any philosophical system of which I'm currently aware. Because these aren't just correspondences; they're showing up as analytic structures several times over.